Are you communicating those values every day? I used to think it was the hokiest thing in the world to say, but if people are aligned on values, they can be very different and still get along well enough to work as a very meaningful, stronger team. If people don't have the right values or they're not totally aligned, they could be best friends and end up fighting and not being able to function. And I think that's something that's totally critical to get right. And then I think, the next thing that's really critical to get right is structured accountability. If you don't have the ability to have your door open in your finance department, be able to make your mistakes or do things, with real transparency and accountability to your team or to your investors or to your partners, that is something that's a really important red flag. Trust has to be there. And if you have a door open policy on everything, so everybody can see exactly what's happening, odds are they probably won't bother, but it really does create an important fundamental element in this type of business, and that is trust and transparency, right? So the businesses that are open to holding themselves accountable, the leaders that hold themselves accountable, and if they're not able to be accountable, like I'm not always the strongest on structure, but knowing that and then making sure that someone who's very good at that is able to do that piece, those are things that add a huge amount of value to a practice. And I suppose, making sure that you have the right tools in place is always, I think that's almost a given, right? You'd want to have the right ultrasound machine. You'd want to have the right, the right cable, whether it's a hydraulic or it's fixed. You want to make sure that if you're going to use image equipment, it's always top notch. It's always well certified. You do the same thing with your management tools. What I find is that physicians often, because they're not trained on those pieces of equipment, they're trained on a fluoro, but they're not trained on an EMR. They're not trained on QuickBooks. They don't necessarily understand how that piece works. And so I'd say, a real pillar, like a fundamental pillar of understanding how to thrive in your professional service business is also making sure that you really understand how to read an income statement, how to read a balance sheet, how to ask questions about, how much money is coming in and when is it coming in, right? There's a huge difference between profit and cash flow. Things like that, I think, are really critical questions to ask. And I guess to go a step further, if I was a physician and I was interviewing at a clinic, those are questions I would want to ask, right? Like in Ontario, as an example, doctors, OHIP pays on the 15th of the month. Great. Okay. Well, if we know that, what's the profitability like of this practice? Is it going to be around any year? And what's the cash flow like in this practice? Do I ever have to worry that they're going to dip into my overheads? Or are the operating lines reasonable? Are they saving money for rainy days? Is there cash in the practice? In my experience, I would much rather pay 5% more overhead to a group that's well managed, well organized, has cash in the bank, and is well staffed, than save the 5 points and worry about what corners they're cutting because I'm not paying enough to keep them running well.
What's a typical actual profitability margin for a well-run clinic or compared to the average clinic? Like, what is the actual upside there to have your machine well-oiled?
Wow. Well, how long is a piece of string? I'll give you a couple of examples, and maybe that'll help to answer the question. I say often to people who ask, it's never about the percentage that you pay in overhead. It's always about the dollar amount that you get at the end of the day. And for practices that are well managed, they'll be able to say to you, at 25% or 20% overhead, we can't afford the anesthesia assistant. We can't afford the nurse that can do a lot of the work under the Delegated Care Act. We can't afford the things that you need to be able to get your clinical flow up from, let's say, 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 patients an hour, or, from 3 to 6 patients an hour, and make sure that we're delivering that the caliber of care that the patient demands, to the patient as well. In a well-run clinic, and it's a bit of a loaded question because it would depend on things like, where is the clinic located? How big is the clinic? How fancy is the clinic office building? I would, like when I get asked where would I build, I would always build in a third-rate building and build a first-class facility, because on the grand scheme of things, especially if you're on the main floor, it is much, much, much cheaper in the long run to do it that way than to build in a Class A building it's got a ton of traffic and have to keep up with the other tenants, knowing that monthly nut that you've got to pay out is 2 or 3 or 4 times the size. It just adds a very different level of pressure. But coming back to your question about margins, ideally, I'm making more cash, more revenue, more money for me at the end of the month, and the clinic is running at a minimum an 8 to 10% net margin, and ideally a 12 to 15% net margin. I always want to pay groups that are doing very well because what it means is that if I ever have an issue, I know that they're there. If there's ever an issue that comes up in the practice that's out of my control, they're not skating and skimming. They're able to deal with it in a way that's quick and effective, and their profitability is disproportionately more important than mine, right? I make enough money as a physician that, if I miss an hour or two, it's annoying, but it's not, ideally, it's not life or death. When you're dealing with an overhead split, that efficiency and that uptime is a lot like a factory. Every second that you're not working, it often is really difficult for the clinic, right? Clinics generally will make their profit at that top 20% of efficiency. If you're running a clinic or you're in a clinic and that clinic is, 60, 70% capacity, and they can get to 80%, but there's just a couple of hurdles in the way, if you make the effort to help them get to that 80%, their lives are monumentally better. And the impact to you is only that you're going along for the ride.
Is bigger better? Like just in terms of more volume, more doctors, more patients, does that tend to just scale nicely and linearly or exponentially even? Or is there like an ideal size of clinic that you've come across?
Totally great question too. No, there is no ideal size of clinic or practice. There is no necessary sweet spot. It depends on the type of practice, the staffing model, how things are set up. Are patients well prepared going into the practice? Have they been primed on what to do, what to wear, how to change, how to change clothes if it's a surgical center, there's some type of intervention. The clinical flow is the biggest. I would say if there was a performance indicator, if there was one thing I could look around and tell this place is doing well or this isn't, it's cleanliness and clinical flow. If there's a wait room that isn't too busy, that everybody's organized, the schedule's running on time, it looks good, everybody's happy and smiling, and things are really moving well, that's a place that's making money. It can always be busier, but when it's too busy, what happens is that the staff are strained and they may not be too happy about it. The patients will get upset. They won't necessarily come back and they won't tell their friends. And what that means is that over the long run, that business won't be sustainable the way it is, right? They might be running too fast or too hard. And if they're running too fast and too hard, and it seems like they're not making enough money, what that would tell me is that the overheads are actually too low. And again, I cannot tell people enough, and it sounds totally counterintuitive, but if the overheads are too low and that business is killing itself to be able to break even or make a 4 or 5, even an 8% margin, you would never work on an 8% margin. So asking the partner that you trust with your time, your reputation, your patients, all of your medical records and everything to do that it's not sustainable, right? And I think that that's a huge issue with our healthcare system. So when I'm looking at a clinic, I always want to make sure that the place is clean, staff have nice aligned, views, and that on the right clinical days, and especially the days where I'll be the critical mass and I'll add value, it's well staffed, it's reasonably well organized, and I know that I can have a full day without running, to a place of panic and sweat.
I'm Dr. Jordan Vollrath, and you've been watching Cherry Live, brought to you by Cherry Health. Please like and subscribe to see more clips like this, or check us out at www.cherry.health, Canada's medical network.